Welcome to this, the first of our evidence. It is the first, isn't it? Yes, the first of our evidence sessions in our inquiry on EV charging, and I'm very pleased to welcome our witnesses. If you could each introduce yourselves. Going from left to right.
Good morning, I'm Jarrod Birch. I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at ChargeUK. We are the trade association for the EV charging sector.
Good morning, I'm David Boyer, the Director of Electricity Systems for the Energy Networks Association. So we represent all the electricity network operators, transmission and distribution, but much of the discussion we'd like to bring forward today will be related to the distribution network operators in particular.
Good morning, my name is Nicole Bulawa. I'm a researcher at Lancaster University, and I did a research project on the electric vehicle infrastructure and its legitimization.
Good morning, Wesley Scott. I head up Industrial Sales and Solutions at Brook Supply. We're a B2B power supplier to obviously lots of transport businesses.
Good morning, I'm Esme Yuill. I'm the Head of External Affairs at Transport East. We're the subnational transport body that covers Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Southend and Thurrock, and we've been supporting our local authority partners with data and analytics around the EV rollout.
Thank you very much. So each in turn, and obviously if you don't need to repeat something that one of your others has already said, but what is the current state of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles in the UK, and is quick enough progress being made?
In a word, yes. I think quick enough progress is being made. We now have 88,000 public charge points in the UK. That's a more than doubling in just under 3 years, which I think by any measure is pretty impressive. We think that equates to about one charge point being installed every 30 minutes. And of course, not often shared in the headline stats is the 1 million home and workplace charge points which support that public network and play a really important role. That's the charging sector that works hand in hand with the vehicle market, which we think is in good health. There are now over 1.8 million battery electric vehicles on the road, with 500,000 of those sold last year alone. And importantly, we think drivers are very happy both with their vehicles and with the charging. Only 3% of people that have an electric vehicle today say they would go back. 95% would recommend an EV to a friend, which I think is fantastic news. We think this is the start of a sort of British success story, rolling out infrastructure across the country at speed. But we also know that there's some issues that we hear about from drivers and indeed from MPs. We know that to get the next 88,000 installed and sell the next 1.8 million EVs, we need to do more. There's two issues that we hear more than any others. First is that prices have risen for public charging, about 38% since 2021. And we also hear, indeed, from MPs that we'd like to see lots more charge points in lots more areas. Helpfully, we think there's a single underlying driver to those sort of drawbacks, and it's the high and rapidly increasing costs of operating charging infrastructure, not so much for getting them in the ground, but keeping them operating. And that's not really the wholesale prices, it's the fixed standing charges that we pay to stay connected to the grid. And so those are being passed through, given where we are as a market, to drivers in the form of higher prices. But also meaning that we have to make difficult decisions about deployment in some areas. So if I flip that to a positive, I think if we can solve those issues, which we think are caused by policy, we think we can create the conditions for better prices. And we also think we can create the conditions for much more charging deployment and unlock a sort of charge point boom over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. David.
Thank you very much for having us to provide input. So just to start in terms from the network operator's perspective, their role in this environment is to provide the connection services that the charge points connect to enable them to be powered and connected to the grid, and also to continue to reinforce and provide the local wider network capacity that supports that charging. So they don't install the charge points themselves. But within that role, we do think that there is a lot happening, a lot of good progress being made. Network operators all across the country have as key focuses providing those connection services to the EV charge point customers and continuing to expand the network to provide the capacity that supports all of this infrastructure and the EV transition. The couple of things that we'd kind of call out in terms of how we can build on that progress and continue to work. One is that the limiting factor often in delivering those connections and that wider infrastructure is planning and consenting delays to the delivery of infrastructure. So there's several areas of reform there that will enable the acceleration of that infrastructure in this transition. And the other is that we need to continue to have an investable framework in which the networks can bring that capital and that network expansion that the EV transition will continue to need.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, I agree that we made a lot of progress and that electric vehicle drivers do acknowledge that, especially the early ones and the early adopters. At the same time, there are points of opportunities in terms of, the more rural areas in the country that also do need to be connected if we want EVs to really take on and be acknowledged by and adopted, by the wider public. And I think points that were raised, like pricing, but also visibility of the infrastructure, placing it there where we live our lives, where we shop, where we go to work, where we live, is one of the key factors to improve that.
I think there's definitely been some really strong progress on the public charge point networks over the past few years. And I think operating those networks, as my colleague ChargeUK said, is becoming increasingly expensive, which we'll probably go on to later on. I think one thing to think about is actually some of those private networks, so people operating delivery fleets, some of the depots for buses, some of the HGV charging. I think that sector is probably lagging a little bit further behind.
We're also coming on to that as well, but thank you.
So a bit of a yes and a no answer.
Right, okay.
Broadly agree from the local authority perspective. So our evidence shows that within the East, charge point deployment is largely aligning with EV take-up numbers. We do have challenges within the East of having a high rural population, and those are the areas which is more of a struggle to make the commercial case for. But we've also baselined that against and tracked that against a couple of years. So we are beginning to see, both from the charge point perspective and from the ownership perspective, that progress is beginning to drift a little. We can estimate when the East will hit 50% ownership, and currently that's looking like it's at 2031. But if you look at data from the last 4 years, that 50% push-out rate is drifting to 2035. So there is a slowing across both the ownership and the charge point infrastructure, which I think is reflected probably by the points made by my colleagues in the challenges.
Okay, thank you, Esme. Now for my colleagues' questions. Jacob.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My questions kind of pull out some of the issues that we just spoke about. So first of all, where is an expansion of public charging infrastructure currently needed the most? Perhaps if we go to Jarrod first.
Thank you. I suppose we're going to need expansion everywhere. If we stopped building charging infrastructure anywhere in this country today, we will clearly not keep up with demand. As colleagues have made clear, we've been keeping track with demand, and we actually think we're a little bit ahead of vehicle demand at the moment, but we need to keep going everywhere, even in those places where we have lots of infrastructure. I think the challenge with mapping where we're behind and where we need to make more progress is, as I mentioned, that the private charging numbers are not necessarily reflected in the headline public charging numbers. And what we see is that in the areas where there's more off-street parking in rural regions, there is less public charging, but there is probably more private charging, which is not featuring in the numbers. Having said that, and recognising that rural areas will probably always have slightly fewer charge points because of that, there are still gaps in areas like rural areas or areas where EV uptake so far has been weaker because the commercial viability of investing in those locations is harder to make work. Wes mentioned the energy costs, and I'm sure we'll come on to it. That has essentially raised the bar at which we invest. The fixed costs are so much higher today than they were in 2021 that fewer sites pass that bar, and those will generally be the sites where we expect utilisation to be lower because there's less traffic, less footfall, less utilisation overall. So that's a bit of a tour around lots of different issues in one, but I think the answer is we need to improve everywhere, and we will. There are particular issues where utilisation is expected to be lower because the commercial case has weakened somewhat since 2020.
It is true that there's a regional variation,
Yeah.
and most of it tends to be currently in London and the South East, doesn't it? So how do you think that should be changed?
So I think partly that reflects the level of off-street parking in London. Obviously, off-street parking in cities in general is lower, but London is particularly weak on off-street parking. And there's been a massive deployment of on-street public charging in lampposts or in standalone columns to kind of replace the fact that many people can't access home charging in those areas. So that's the reason why constituencies like the Chairs has lots of on-street charge points, because there are fewer private charge points. London is indeed ahead at this point, but we think everywhere will grow.
Does anyone have anything to add to that?
I guess just from my side, I think, obviously I echo a lot of the points you just covered, but I think on the rural side, what we're asking charge point operators to do on the public networks is actually build out quite a large, fixed infrastructure asset. To actually build some of these sites, it's super expensive just in the groundworks, but also getting the connection is increasingly difficult in this country. We need to electrify vast portions of the nation for decarbonisation purposes. Actually getting land, getting grid connection is harder in rural areas, which is obviously going to play a part in producing actual uptake.
So just to add on that, from the East perspective, despite actually, the views potentially of the region, around a quarter of our households have on-street parking, and that's particularly high in areas like Thurrock and Southend. But equally in rural spaces, a lot of our market towns and small villages are medieval street patterns. They're heritage houses without even a path outside them. So the ability, and they're conservation areas. So the ability to design and implement solutions that fit that environment does also then add cost onto those, what would have been a standard design process.
Dr. Bulawa, you spoke about the challenge that we have with rural communities. I think only 15% of charges are in rural areas at the minute. Have you got any suggestions for what government should do to improve this?
I think it's worth looking outside of the UK for that, because there's a lot of countries where people don't live in houses, where they don't have their own driveway, but they do have an EV infrastructure in place. They have more charging points than the UK, for instance. I think in Germany or in France, and the Netherlands, I think, is at top at the moment. And as I said earlier, they implemented a lot of public charging at places where you live your life. So at work, when you go for a shop. So at a lot of other places, so that you don't necessarily have or need a charge at home, because you don't need to charge your EV every single day, right? And I think this is something that we should consider, and maybe having all this, as Jarrod said, the supplementary charging infrastructure makes a difference, and maybe may reduce the need for charging at home.
David, you spoke about the challenges of planning and reforms that are needed. Have you got any suggestions on specific things that you'd like to see?
We do, yes. So we'd supported and do support the Planning and Infrastructure Act that has provided some benefits to charge point installers and also for larger transmission projects. But it doesn't go far enough, and there are some significant challenges, particularly for smaller and more distribution infrastructure projects that are left unaddressed. Our recommendations specifically are that right now electricity network operators don't have powers that similar utilities do to serve notice and progress works. We recommend the reform is done to bring that into line, which supports deployment of network assets at pace. Right now, there needs to be reforms on the way leaves process to provide defined timescales. It's often open-ended and creates uncertainty and delay. There's also a need to amend the Electricity Act that would allow the upgrade of capacity in existing overhead lines without going through new land rights and way leaves processes. Right now, adding another conductor to an existing overhead line requires net new processes and rights being achieved. And then finally, if we were to reform and merge the access rights with the way-leaves process, then that would significantly streamline and kind of accelerate the process of getting access to and delivering work on either new assets or even just maintaining existing assets. Those are specific recommendations that we'd provided into the DESNA's consultation on this topic, and continue to liaise with them to support their progress.
David, on the issue of way-leave, because this was raised with me some years ago by a large EV sales company. Is it possible to overcome the way-leave problem, which is common law, with statute, or are the two legal systems completely incompatible?
I think I would have to come back to you, if I'm honest, on the gritty details of how it's best implemented. I know that's one area of discussion with DESNAs on this, okay, is how it might best be implemented. If it's possible to explore ways to do so without legislation and statute override, then from a procedural and process point of view, that would definitely be of benefit. But I'm happy to write and follow up on more details.
Thank you. East of England, you've not come across that challenge. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. Morning all. Thanks very much for giving evidence today. My first question is about charger technology. It'd be really helpful to understand how fast it's developing and whether the chargers that are being rolled out now are keeping pace with the development of vehicles. Mr. Birch, you all right to start off on that one?
Absolutely. So what we see is that every part of the market, whether you're at the relatively slow end, which is intended essentially to replicate a home charger in terms of overnight charging, you're parked up on your street, and you wake up in the morning with a full battery, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, what we call ultra rapid, which is 150 kilowatt plus, which will give you a full battery in practically no time. All of those segments are growing. Over the last 2 to 3 years, the ultra rapid segment has grown the most, so the quickest chargers have grown by the most. The stat I have here is that since 2023, that part of the market has grown by 157%, which we're quite pleased with. Yeah. What we will see is actually a mix of those depending on the location. So that segment has grown very significantly over the last 3 years in the form of standalone hubs where people can go and almost get a petrol-like experience. What we will see probably over the next couple of years is that progress continuing, but being matched by progress at the lower end of the spectrum as part of the local EV infrastructure fund. That's government funding that's going to bring us 100,000 charge points, mainly at that end of the spectrum. And that, I think, is deliberate for two reasons. One is that it's on street, so it's going to be an overnight charge. And the other is that those are extremely cost effective to deploy with public money. So we'll probably see progress across the piece, but there's always there's this phrase of right charger in the right place. The speed matters depending on where you are. If you're plugged in overnight, then a slow charger is perfectly sufficient and actually probably the right solution.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open this up to others on the panel in a minute, but I wondered if Mr. Scott, you had any comments on this in particular in terms of charger technology.
Yeah, I think charge technology, again, I echo what you just said, actually just needs to be targeted at the right end, like customer. So where you've got on-street like charging, there's no point putting an ultra rapid there because people often don't need that. But where you've got big depots and you're trying to charge a HGV that's got a much larger battery, you do actually need that ultra rapid charger to facilitate that essentially. So I think there has been a lot of progress made. We're seeing customers developing charging infrastructure up to 1 megawatt, which is huge, to be honest, in terms of power demand. I would just echo earlier points again, which almost suggests that the cost of doing that is actually going up. In terms of operating it, not necessarily building it, it's just operating it on an ongoing basis. That's where the challenge is.
Well, in terms of sort of keeping pace with the development of vehicles, does anyone have any specific comments on that? Yeah.
Take that if you want. So yes, what you see is that vehicles, particularly at the higher end of the market, but increasingly in the sort of mid-tier of the market, are getting quicker. They're moving to an 800 volt battery architecture, which means they can charge much quicker, above and beyond 350 kilowatt, which 3 or 4 years ago would have been unthinkable, and as Wes said, up to 1 megawatt. So the vehicle's getting quicker, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire network has to get quicker for the reasons we've set out. It's the right speed when you need it. But yes, the vehicles are getting quicker and the chargers are getting quicker as well, in general.
Okay, thank you very much. Alex?
Thank you. Recent changes to legislation mean that the installation of charging infrastructure can now be done with street works permits rather than a Section 50 licence, so like what utility companies use. So hopefully you've all read our previous report about digging up roads and making them okay again afterwards. Do you think that this change is going to have an impact upon how many chargers are put in?
Yes. It will make it quicker and cheaper for us to install chargers, particularly on-street chargers where street works are most relevant. I would echo what the government have in their communications about this, which is Section 50 licences were costing us between £500 and £1,000 per licence. Permits cost more like £45 to £130, so a night and day difference. Section 50 licences also can take 12 or more weeks to receive back. Permits more like 3 to 5 days. That is clearly going to make a massive impact on our speed and ease of deployment, which is very welcome. We're just working through some of the details now with how we enter the street works permit regime in a responsible and seamless way. So working with the department as well as the highways authorities and utilities to ensure that we kind of play our role responsibly.
Just to come in on that. So one of our local authorities sought legal advice on this clarification point, and it came back inconclusive. So at the minute, they're not, those that I've spoken to are going to continue for the time being with the Section 50 processes, and I think there does need to be some joint working done, between government, the industry, local authorities, to understand, to have guidance around and confidence to make sure that authorities are comfortable moving forward to a permitting regime in as speedily as possible.
And who did they seek advice from? Which came back?
It was within their own legal team.
Right. Okay. Understood. And then just building on that, i.e. the role of highways authorities and local authorities, I mean, they have a kind of coordinating and enabling role. Are they the best placed to be doing this, or might it be argued that they're a bit small and we keep reinventing the wheel in lots of different parts of the country? Perhaps Esme.
Yeah, I think capacity and capability within local authorities is a challenge. The DFT funding on this has really helped them move forward, particularly in the EV teams. But that point around legal support, procurement support, and others within local authorities can become a blocker within the processes in terms of deploying funding and getting things out on the ground as fast as possible. I mean, obviously they are the democratically responsible bodies for their local areas, and I think whilst standardisation and guidance is always very welcome in order to keep consistency, each authority has its own unique challenges and opportunities, and I think wouldn't want to cede any control over what is deployed across their networks.
They might not want to, but it might be a good idea. Anyone else got anything else to add on that?
Just very quickly to note that in principle, there's the potential for a convening role that other parts of government could play in bringing more of the actors together, not necessarily to change or override local authorities or in any way, but it is a complex space with charge point installers working along with independent networks and providers, landowners, highways, local authorities, and the network operators themselves that I represent. So in that kind of complex environment, there definitely is the potential for acceleration and more clarity and forward progress if there's some more convening and coordinating roles that kind of wider government could play.
Thank you.
Okay, just going back to the Section 50 licence. In Hounslow, the on-street public charging points are through street lamps. Are Section 50 notices or permissions, specific legal permissions needed to do that? And if not, why is that solution not more universally used by local authorities?
I would have to confirm this, but I think they would still need Section 50 licences and in future permits to do some of the supporting works. But I'll come back to you on that.
Because there's no physical extra
no,
kit.
it's within the larger column itself, but you may need to do work on the feeder pillar and some of the groundworks around that. So I believe they use Section 50 licences today, and would like to make use of permits in the future.
Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. The point's already been made, I think, in this panel that at the moment the department publishes data on public charging points. In respect of private charging points, is there additional information that you feel that the department could or should be drawing on? And if the answer is no, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how that data could be collected in the future. If anyone wants to.
I think it'd be really helpful if we did have better sight on what's been deployed in private locations, whether that's residential or workplaces, because as I said at the beginning of the session, it's a really important part of the picture. If we look purely at public charging numbers, we miss the fact that people have home charge points, workplace charge points, even depot charge points that also enable them to keep their vehicles moving. So it feels somewhat like we're looking at only part of the picture and we're not getting a full view. I think one challenge that there has been is that we don't necessarily know where private charge points have been deployed. Historically, there was, of course, the electric vehicle home charge scheme through which government supported the delivery and the deployment of those points. So then we had some data. But as those grants are slowly fading away in recognition of the transition kind of maturing, I think we're sometimes lacking some visibility of where those have been. I do think it would be fantastic if we could find a way to resolve that problem, because then we would have a full picture of where charging infrastructure is, both public and private. And then I think we could have a much more detailed discussion about where the gaps might be and how to fill them.
Yeah, just to add to that side, so as part of the DCP 420 modification that we worked with industry on, this is a point that we raised around just data in general. I think it's very hard to tell how much electricity is being supplied, and also the number of charge points actually within GB at the moment. I think that is just honestly a data issue. I think a lot of the points, a lot of sites around the country are going to be multi-use, so that's going to be a hard piece of work, where you've got, you know, a depot site that's historically not, you know, is supplying factory. There's going to be a car park in that factory that then is going to end up putting chargers on. So actually attaining that information and how you do that is hard, and it needs to be looked at.
Thank you. Mr. Bower, I saw you indicated.
Yes, just to add, from a network operator's perspective, there's limits on how much data they have or is appropriate for them to have in terms of what customers are using their electricity connections for, but they definitely are supportive of the principle of what's being driven out of here, a more comprehensive understanding of what's out there, and potentially even looking forward into how that might need to evolve and increase. Anything that gives that comprehensive picture and a forward view of that picture allows infrastructure planning on the network side, but also on charge point installation side to be better coordinated. The only other thing I noticed, I know that the DESNZ has operated a call for evidence last year to look at ways in which the installers certified and otherwise can be a point at which that data can be collected, and networks have been discussing that with DESNZ, which I'll call attention to.
Thank you. And just before we move on, is there any indication from the partial picture that we do have that private installations mirror some of the uneven nature of public installations, thinking about regional variation, urban, rural, income differences?
So from our work on the propensity to adopt, that would definitely be reflective. So, you know, looking at the Transport East areas of higher income, those with off-street parking and younger communities tend to be the ones that are adopting faster, and I just expect that to be mirrored across the private charge network as well as those using the public charge network as well. So from a public perspective, having that assumption and that data verified by understanding the private network more clearly would be really helpful. It would be able to guide the EV rollout strategies of local authorities and focus the attention of public money into areas where you know that those gaps are going to potentially, both from a demographic perspective as well as a geographic perspective, where those barriers and hurdles are most complex.
Thank you. And moving on to the grid and grid capacity, the Committee on Climate Change and other bodies have identified grid capacity as a potential barrier to EV take-up in at least some areas. And from your perspective, how much are the well-advertised problems with getting new grid connections and new grid capacity a constraint on charging point installation?
Well, I'll be happy to start on that one, and thank you for the question. It's an important focus. All the network operators are really, it's one of their top priorities to continue to operate good connection services for any customers looking to connect to the grid. In terms of distribution connections, and particularly demand connections, including EV charge points, the first thing to say is the vast majority of those connections are progressed in line with the customer's timelines and requests. If you look at how many are provided on standard connection times or in line with the projects, the customer's project timelines, then that is the majority of connection services delivered by networks. And actually some of the numbers that were quoted earlier about how many charge points are connected and publicly available now, all of those are ultimately connected to the grid, and that doubling in the last few years was supported by energized connections on the network operator's side. Network operators are continuing to work to see how that can be continued to be improved and accelerated. It's an important focus. So, for example, they supported an Ofgem-led program at the start of the current price control period to reform access and grid connection charges, which means that EV charge customers have a lower upfront connection charge. Network operators have also launched Connect Direct, which is a simple digital single portal for domestic applications for EV chargers, and that's actually had quite a significant utilization already, with over 300,000 customer applications processed, and 40-50% of those are now actually being auto-approved by the digital interface and some artificial intelligence capability, which means customers don't have to wait at all. They have instant approval. It is the case that as there are larger and larger connection requests being made, and if those, particularly in areas where there is not as much existing infrastructure, then those are sometimes larger pieces of investment to deliver to support those connections. Again, networks are very focused on delivering that as quickly as possible. And the planning and wayleaves and consents delays I mentioned before are some of the key critical path barriers, not engineering capability, but the planning and wayleaves processes that add to that critical path. But it's a continuing area of focus, definitely.
Thank you. And you mentioned that the vast majority of applications are resolved on a satisfactory timetable, we'd hope. For the minority that are not, do those applications have particular characteristics? I mean, is there a pattern to delays for particular applications?
The most significant, most significant point to note it'd be places where there's a very large capacity request. There's no two connection requests really are the same, and there's not one size fits all for EV charge points. Some of the ultra rapid hubs that we've been talking about and the EHEV connection requests are significant infrastructure, tens and hundreds of megawatts that would be equivalent to towns worth of electricity network capacity. So at that scale, then where the customer agrees and funds the works, the networks will deliver those connections as quickly as possible. It's most to do with either the amount of capacity being requested, or if it is indeed in some of those locations where there is no existing infrastructure, and that's work and delivery that the network operators need to provide for the customer.
So at the moment, it's more about the characteristics of the application rather than the capacity of the grid in a particular area.
It is a bit of a combination of both, but it definitely starts with the amount of power being requested in the application, yes.
Yeah, and I don't think it can be understated, just in terms of the scale, you're completely right. Some of these sites where you've got a bus depot charging site, that's going to draw the equivalent power of a small factory into that site. So actually, the time it takes to build that and get that application approved, yeah, it's long, but actually that is because it's a significant piece of infrastructure and requires, serious grid upgrades.
And then looking to the future over the next, say, 10 years, do you see grid constraints becoming a more serious problem for the EV rollout?
From the network operator's perspective, the first thing to say is that networks are currently delivering one of the largest programs of investment in grid expansion in their sector's history. So there's a significant program of works underway to continue to expand the grid and make sure it keeps pace with and meets those kind of needs of all of the network stakeholders. We're currently in the middle of a price control process, a period in which the investment program's approved and being delivered, and networks are very focused on that. But when we look forward, we're now starting the process of preparing business plans. All the network operators are preparing business plans for the next distribution price control period, ED3, and going and discussing that extensively with Ofgem. What's really important in that context is that regulatory framework and those business plans and investment plans are approved and in a way that allows the network operators to bring that capital and that investment into the country to continue the grid expansion in line with these EV targets, as well as other important government policies such as the clean power transition and more economic growth more generally.
So, from reading between the lines, are you saying that if that approval process doesn't happen in the way that the network operators are applying for, then actually there could be a significant constraint in the future?
Yes, is the simple answer. If it's the case that we're not approved or not able to bring the capital in and deliver those investments through that regulatory framework and process, then the network infrastructure in the long term may not keep pace.
Does anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, I'll add just to that I guess grid capacity and electrification of sites is probably the number one thing that we're talking to customers about at the moment, transport aside, just in general. A lot of the time when customers are looking at how they can electrify their transport, the first question they're asking internally is, do we have grid capacity to actually go and do that? And what are the lead times and the costs of getting that? It's not even whether there's an investment case or the availability of the infrastructure to buy. It's actually where there's grid capacity. I'd go as far as saying it's probably a barrier to investment and growth across the sector moving forward. And it's not going to ease as other industries and other sectors continually demand more and more grid capacity, whether that's data centres or other areas of industrials electrifying their operations. So I think it's going to be an increasing issue going forward.
Just thinking about geographic dispersion and the regionality point that we've talked about before, what are the areas of the country where you are seeing those restraints most clearly?
I think probably areas like if you look at some of the industrial clusters around the country, those are areas that have typically already been built up with that grid capacity. So then upgrading that further is, that requires almost complete replacement of all of the networks in those areas. To be honest, it's quite a hard question to answer. There's a demand everywhere at the moment for infrastructure and grid capacity.
Okay. And just one final question, if anyone wants to come in on this in particular, how engaged is the DfT in these questions? And presumably the department is fighting across Whitehall and the regulators for EVs to have their fair share of new connections. Is that the case?
I would say so. I think the DfT is in a little bit of a difficult spot in that they don't own grid policy. That's DESNZ and Ofgem's responsibility. I think DfT is putting up a pretty good fight on behalf of the charging sector in recognition of the role that it will play, both from a decarbonisation perspective but energy security as well. I think they're doing their best, and I certainly wouldn't sit here and criticise them for the work they've done. They convened a grid connections review between ENA, ChargeUK and individual members of ours over the last year, which has made some progress. I think, unfortunately, there is still more to do, and clearly DfT is not the biggest hitter in that room. So I think I wouldn't aim my ire at DfT necessarily. I think DESNZ and Ofgem probably need to lean in a little bit more and recognise the importance of the sector in the same way that we see they're doing for data centres and these other emerging sources of demand.
That's helpful. Thank you, Lawrence. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've touched on some of what I'm going to ask already, but please do add to it. We're seeing in some sectors that the electricity costs are really having an impact on people doing the right thing, if I can use that phrase. So in the rail freight sector, for example, we've seen some freight operators retire their electric locomotives in favour of diesel because of electricity charges. So in the context of this sector, how are electricity costs impacting the economic sustainability of charging infrastructure, and does that vary across different parts of the country and types of geography? Who'd like to start?
I'll kick off. So we've seen electricity costs change a lot for this sector, especially in the past 5 years. I guess if you take it back a step, actually looking at how we operate the electricity cost stack at the moment, So about 60% of a business bill will be a non-commodity charge. So that's nothing to do with the cost of actually generating electricity. It's the cost of running the networks, environmental tariffs, and some of the other ones. I think across Europe, a lot of those costs fall into central government taxation. So businesses don't pay those bills, that portion of the bill, sorry. What we then saw in 2019 was the implementation of TCR, which is a targeted charging review by Ofgem. That changed the way that the transmission and distribution costs were apportioned in bills. That basically moved a lot of those costs away from the unit rate, so the pence per kilowatt hour rate that businesses pay, onto a fixed standing charge. And that actually, the way that was apportioned and the way that it was calculated is basically done on capacity. A lot of the sites we're talking about require lots of capacity. So when we modelled that sort of in our portfolio at Brook Green, the losers of that almost policy were all of the charge point operators and stadiums. If you think about the model of what those sites are, they're high capacity, at the moment low utilisation. So actually the fixed costs of those sites have just ramped up at a time when, I guess, uptake of electric transport has probably been slightly below where forecasts were. So actually the operating costs of those sites purely on the electricity side of things have just gone through the roof. And we modelled, as an example, we modelled a site in London which would be like almost a depot charging. The costs of operating that site from 2019 to 2029 will have gone from £100,000 to £500,000 using the same amount of electricity, which is a significant amount, and that's a year, sorry. So a significant change in just the actual structure of the policy and the way that cost is apportioned to essentially this sector and the charging sector in general.
We ran some similar analysis and found basically the same thing. We asked Cornwall Insiders, the independent analysts, to collect some data from our members on sites they already operated and how those costs had changed, how their bills had changed since 2021. They found a 462% increase in the standing charge, which I think matches up quite well with what Wes said. And similarly, we've got examples of sites with 4 rapid charge points which had a standing charge of about £100 in 2021. And later this year will be more like 40 to 50 grand. It's an unbelievable increase. That means something to the drivers because we're pre-profit. We've been asked to deploy this infrastructure ahead of demand, so we're doing so. We're taking a large capacity, not getting much usage now, but hoping to in the future, or expecting to in the future. And so we have to pass the cost on. So our calculations suggest that a driver used to pay 1 to 2 pence per kilowatt hour on a charging session. On a rapid charging session. Now that's more like 20 to 30 pence per kilowatt hour of a, let's say, 80 pence per kilowatt hour session. So drivers are paying for this increasing cost.
I would just say this has been recognised within the industry. So there's been a few modifications. Like I said earlier, there's one called DCP 420, which was almost looking at public charging infrastructure and how to essentially reduce some of those fixed standing charge costs for it. That policy has been sort of in the pipeline for 2 to 3 years now. So I think we're quite keen to see some almost central government push alongside Ofgem push to actually get that finalised and get some of the suggestions and amendments in place, which would help alleviate some of the things that we've just discussed.
Okay, so you feel the government is engaging with the issue, but they need to get on with it? Yeah,
so that's being run as a decrees of working group at the moment, but I think we feel we need a bit more, speed and oomph. It's probably a good word.
It's a good word. I don't want to put words in Wes' mouth, but I was thinking as you said that, I think they're engaging, but they're not owning it.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very clear.
Just very quickly to add from a network operator's perspective, network operators, I think the characterization there of it as an apportionment decision is a good way to think about it, and that policy and that kind of structure and what's the right answer is something that having some oomph and ownership, networks would support, and they're leaning into to support that process, not as the setters, but as part of the stakeholders in that. Network charges are only around 12% of the typical dual fuel bill, so it's actually quite a small component relative to the standing charge, which is a larger thing that's set by the retailers and includes many other costs than network charges. So it is a complex space, but we'd support that oomph requirement.
So I did have a question for you, David Boyd, perhaps partly related to this. So we've heard an argument that distribution network operators should have the same access powers and rights over land as other utility providers. Do you agree, and how would this help with some of the issues we've been discussing?
Thank you. It's an important question. It's something I touched on earlier, and the simple answer is yes, we do agree. We think that would absolutely bear benefits to the delivery of electricity network infrastructure. To bring it to life, for a minor and relatively unobtrusive piece of work to upgrade the telecoms network, takes as little as 2 months to go through the serving notice and progressing works process. That takes up to 17 months for a distribution network operator to do the same type of works.
Yeah, that's a very staggering figure, isn't it?
And that will directly impact both the general timeliness of network upgrades, but also very specifically connections works to serve, for example, EV charge points.
Thank you. Jacob.
Thank you. We've heard evidence about a shortage of skills within the sector, specifically those needed for delivering charging infrastructure, so the installation, service and repair. If you also think that, what do you think that the government should be doing to support this? Dr. Bulawa, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. So I think we do have a skills shortage in that area. I think there's data to support this. When I collected some data, I think 2 years ago, I talked to one of the biggest charging operators at the time, and I think they had 5 people to do the maintenance of the entire charging network, which isn't a lot of people if you consider how big the UK is. And I think points that were raised were, for one, so you need specific training to do that kind of job because there's a lot of safety requirements, which is rightfully so, but at the same time, those technicians raise the fact that they have to pay for the training themselves, which keeps quite a few people away from that area. It's a very basic thing, and I kind of would have expected the company to pay for their training, but that wasn't apparently the case, so I would assume that this might also apply to other companies in that field. Now, when we see how the infrastructure grows, how electric vehicles grow and the adoption numbers grow, we cannot see the same uptake in terms of people who have these skills and who do actually get the certification to do so. I don't have the exact numbers here, but I'm happy to kind of deliver that later. But that goes not only to the maintenance of the charging infrastructure, but also the maintenance of the electric vehicles themselves, obviously.
Anybody else? David?
From network operators' perspective, so currently network operators across the country employ over 26,000 people working on the delivery of all of the services we've been talking about, grid expansion and connection services. But it is clear that we have a skills challenge rolling forward. If we look at the amount of work that needs to go into the sector, if we look at a report by Bayes, as was an Ofgem a few years ago, that estimated that the sector, to deliver the clean growth and decarbonisation and economic growth objectives that we have as a country, that would require up to 50 to 130,000 additional jobs by 2050. So in this context, one thing the network operators are doing collectively via the ENA and also working with BEMA as supply chain association, working to provide and develop an electricity networks sector growth plan, because it's clear that to meet all of these challenges and continue this work, there does need to be growth within the electricity networks sector itself. We set out an interim report at the end of last year that sets out the case for why this infrastructure and this sector's growth is important for the country, and we're doing work this year to provide analysis on how that directly relates to the achievement of targets and objectives like electric vehicle transition, and also to set out the work program and clarity on that helps the skills and supply chains that enable it actually come to being. And so we'd be happy to share that report as when it's completed with the committee.
All right. Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the driver experience. Elsie.
Oh yes, so in the 2025 report, Transport Focus identified significant issues with the charging network, and its inability to meet the needs of disabled drivers. What consideration is given to accessibility when building new charge points? Mr. Birch, do you want to start off with that one?
Absolutely. So I think we almost need to divide this into pre-2022 and post-2022, because 2022 was the year in which publicly available specification 1899 was published. This was the first time we'd had a specification on accessibility in the public charging network. Obviously, there's lots of other specifications and standards which can give you an idea of what an accessible charging session would look like. This was the first time we had something that described in detail, looking at the hardware, the surrounding environment, the built environment around the charge point. And since then, that has made a significant contribution. I think new and renovated charging sites since that date look very, very different than what they did before that point. You will see very many fewer wheel stops and bollards. You will see more accessible bays with space around the bay. There's been changes in the hardware as well. So we have seen some progress. I think the findings that we see sometimes in terms of percentage that are compliant with that specification reflect some niggling issues with the specification that we're working through with disabled groups and with the BSI. The PAS is binary, which I don't think is particularly helpful. It's a pass or fail. And it's particularly not helpful because there are bits in there which are either very difficult or impossible to meet with the hardware that is available on the market, on the global market at the moment. So, for example, there are requirements in the specification on the force required to remove and insert the connector for which hardware is not available to meet that standard. So I think a lot of sites have made a lot of progress, but then are falling short of that bar because of difficulties that are somewhat outside of their control. I think all of that was acknowledged as part of the BSI's review report that came out last year and committed to a review of the specification so that we can have something, a version 2 essentially, that we can build to going forwards.
Has anyone else on the panel got any comments on sort of accessibility standards? No? Okay. So I was going to ask as well, so just sort of to mention, I'm an MP in Harewood and Middleton North, which is in Greater Manchester, and we've got an EVCI strategy there that sets out our city region's ambition for EVCI access to be designed to provide for disabled EV drivers with step-free access and larger parking bays for disabled access. I just wondered where we could look to for best practice in this space and how we can make sure that all combined authorities are sort of making sure they're trying to innovate in this way. I wondered, Ms. Yuill, if you had any views on that.
I think there is obviously genuine challenges around ensuring that type of delivery can be done on your average streetscape given the complexity of the users that are within that space. I'm not aware personally of best practice guidance currently, but I'm happy to come back to the committee with that.
Does anyone on the panel think that mandatory accessibility standards would be something that would be helpful at all? Or not really? Would there be challenges with that? I don't know. Dr. Bulawa, have you got any views on this?
So I think the point that was raised with before 2022, before the standard was introduced, and afterwards, kind of is an interesting point, because when I talk to people or local governments, for instance, before that standard was introduced, there were certain people who said, you know what, accessibility is so important that they already paid attention to these kind of things, like, you know, space, how difficult is it to get it out, are the way, is the charging cable in the way. Accessibility is, it's not a, how do you say, like, it's a multi-dimensional concept. So it's very tricky to account for all the different aspects that people need to access EV charging. At the same time, I think if we would introduce something like more of a requirement, and that doesn't have to be, it needs to fulfill all these specific boxes, but something that is a bit more fluid in a sense, that would actually help to accelerate that. It shouldn't be up to individual persons to decide whether to go for it or not. That's my personal take. And maybe to add on this, I think an aspect that isn't really mentioned quite often, but that might also be important, is the aspect of safety. When you refuel your petrol car, you drive to a petrol station, which is a sheltered space, well lit, with somebody close by. When you charge your EV, you might end up at a parking lot somewhere in the back corner, which is very dimly lit and doesn't really give you the sense of security that you might want to feel if you are loitering around your car for half an hour. And that is something that I haven't seen in these any suggestions or standards, but that is something we should also pay attention to when we actually design the layout of charging places. And I think this becomes even more important once we go to more rural areas where those parking places are most likely less developed, less amenities by, a bit more far off, of other locations.
Yeah, that's helpful, thank you. And I think that's something that's obviously relevant to lots of different road and street users as well. Obviously not just people charging their EVs, but pedestrians, cyclists, others as well, service providers. Have others on the panel kind of got comments to sort of, if you've got any views to make sure that these places are accessible and that people sort of feel safe using the technology? I don't know, maybe start with you, Mr. Birch.
Yeah, so I think we sometimes talk about charging like an orchestra. There's lots of different people involved and everyone has to be singing along, and we're just the front man, so to speak. I don't think this musical analogy is going to go very far. We're the front man, we're the consumer-facing part of that orchestra. Behind us is the hardware manufacturer who we work particularly close with, particularly in the last few years. Those relationships have improved, and of course part of the question about accessibility is the weight of the cable and the connector force and so on. There is also the landlord with whom we're working, whether that's a local authority whose land it is or a private landlord. What we sometimes see is to ensure a session is fully, to ensure a charging site is fully accessible and the session is accessible, you need those parties to play along as well. And you can imagine a conversation with a private landlord saying, can you move this site from back there to a more prominent location, and can you dig up the curb as well, and can you put some hatching down? We would love that, and I think that we've made some progress in that, but the landlord part of this is really important as well. Yeah. They have to be singing to the same tune as us.
Anyone else on the panel?
Just from the public sector perspective, these things are all being written into the tenders for the Levi funding that is going out, particularly, and local authorities particularly, in terms of their site consideration, are putting a lot of these things front and centre and will knock back sites that, while in theory, would get potentially good usage, do not meet certain criteria. The other thing is that they are going out to tenders, on infrastructure that has its own lighting, that comes alongside some of those other consumer assets such as shelter and usability features that go beyond just the charging infrastructure in itself, and are putting the public money into designs and spaces that try and meet as many needs as possible.
Thank you very much.
It's all right, it's Angela Rippon outside, so
is it really?
doing a dance class.
Mandy's just gone to check it out.
They've turned the volume up, haven't they?
Okay. Sorry, Alex. Sorry, thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Looking across the channel at our European neighbours and partners, they have introduced regulations to try and improve availability, reliability and interoperability. Do you think that there are lessons to be learned, and should the UK government be following suit? Who wants to kick us off?
I think that they've already learnt the lessons, or we've taught them the lessons. I'm not sure which way around. I think the regulation is talking about the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation, which do a very, very similar thing at a very similar time to our public charge point regulations. So the public charge point regulations set a new 99% reliability standard to ensure that people can use the charge points, mandate contactless payment terminals on a very large number of charge points on the network, require a 24/7 helpline, require you to make the price available in a common metric up front. That is essentially the same thing as what's happened in AFIR, as it's known. I don't think there's much in their regulations that we've missed, if that's an easy way of saying it.
From a network operator's perspective, the reliability of the grid is one of their top priorities, and in a general sense for all consumers, including EV charge points. And if you look at kind of internationally, Britain enjoys one of the most reliable electricity networks in the world. It's got over 99.999% reliability, and it's a continuing focus throughout on all network operations and focuses, not just for EV charge point customers.
Just from a rural perspective, given that there tends to be a higher average usage and distance and day-to-day journeys in rural areas are longer, more regular charging is going to be required, and if that's from a public charge points, confidence in charging ability is really important, as is charging interoperability. So, if you've got fewer options with your chargers, you need to be able to use any of those chargers realistically and easily. So, moves in the direction of standardisation and interoperability of charging mechanisms, payment mechanisms, etc. is really important. And finally, on the rural issue, digital connectivity is an increasing challenge in that space as well, given that for payments particularly, you need to be able to access 5G connectivity, and I know that operators are deploying their own masts in some locations, which also obviously adds additional cost onto the solutions that are required for rural charging locations.
But within the EU regulations, isn't there also a legal guarantee of coverage every 60 kilometres? Whereas, what do we have in our regulations?
I think that's an obligation aimed at the member states of the European Union. So the obligation is not aimed at the charge point operator, it's aimed at France, Germany, Slovakia, whoever it might be. You need to do things to make sure that this happens. So it's sort of an outcome-based obligation, and it will be the member state that's not compliant with that because they've not put in place the supporting measures. I don't believe it's aimed at the charging sector, so I don't think the model quite transfers into...
Should our government have similar targets nationwide?
I think they could have targets if they make the changes to the cost base that make it more difficult to justify investment in certain locations.
I think Nicole was going to say something, yeah?
I just wanted to add on the standardization aspect. Sorry, this now got a bit sidetracked. But when I did a bit of observation just to see how people cope with charging, and they do not. So they manage to charge their EV, especially when they do this for the first few times. But it's not a smooth process at the moment. Every charging device requires different steps, a different app, a different payment mechanism, and it doesn't always work, and people are confused, just to put it very simply. And I think some standardization, some usability guidance on what are the steps, what should you do, how can you make this a bit easier for the users would help greatly with a bit more confidence in that space.
And then perhaps Esme, on that point, going back to my earlier point, that if we've got all these individual local authorities individually deciding what they're going to put in, does that not harm the user experience? Because as Nicole has just said, you end up driving, literally over the border, out of Bedfordshire into Cambridgeshire, and it's an entirely different system.
I think there needs to be I think there's levels within this, in that some of this can be set at a national level in terms of the operation of charge points and customer-facing interfaces. I think decisions around location and the ultimate decision on whether to put something on street, given that is the responsibility of the Highways Authority, needs to still sit with local authorities. So I think there can be a balance in terms of how much standardisation you can achieve, and then what decisions are still needed to be taken at a local level.
And yet it would appear that in continental Europe it's going to be fine to drive from Germany to Switzerland, and yet driving between Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire might well be different.
I think in terms of user experience, the more that you can make that consistent, that would be great. Mm-hmm. I think the decisions on where infrastructure is placed on the highway still need to sit with highways authorities.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We now move on to home charging. Baggy.
Thank you, Chair. So my constituency, Derby, like many other constituencies, towns and city, there's lots of streets with terraced housing. What needs to be done to address the barriers for adopting EVs for households without off-street parking?
One important part of the picture will be the local EV infrastructure fund, which is nearly £400 million worth of government funding, working with local authorities to deploy in local areas. The government projects that will bring us 100,000 public charge points, mostly on streets, and that's of course more than we have in total today. So it's a lot of charge points coming. There's a great Senex report on where we are with that, and they describe it as the cavalry charge coming in the form of Levi-funded charge points. Those are generally going to be on-street charge points that are the most cost-effective part of the public charging network and allow people to park outside their homes on street and charge up overnight. Of course, there will be a role for faster forms of public charging as well, and there will be cross-pavement charging, which is a relatively new technology allowing people to trail a cable underneath their pavement, underneath the pavement, not their pavement, to their vehicle on the street. So I think what we'll probably see is a mix. I think the Levi-funded charge points will change the picture significantly. We will see very visible, tangible increases in infrastructure on residential streets, including for terraced houses, but both cross-pavement and other forms of public charging will play a role as well.
Yeah, sure.
From a network operator's perspective, also have been very active in participating and supporting the Levi Fund rollout. So network operators, participate in those fora and involved in the conversations around planning for local infrastructure in each area, and actually have set up portals and processes to help those the connection processes for those Levi funded projects. More generally for residential charging, again, the Connect Direct solution that all the networks have deployed and the ENA operate on their behalf, which has really delivered a step change in the ease and simplicity of the customer experience for an individual looking to put charging in their home or near to their home. And finally, in a more general sense, network operators' focus in this kind of context is to make sure they get the right place and regional specific investment programs to deliver the network that those customers and that EV charging would need. It's a big focus in terms of their local stakeholder engagement activities, engaging with local area energy plans, and actually the sector's introduced under the new National Energy System Operator a regional energy system planning function, so that in a consistent way all regions across the country are supporting getting their energy needs fed into infrastructure plans. So that's another important focus and activity the networks are participating in.
Come back to cross-pavement charging in a second. But the off-street charging for homes in multiple occupancy usually means multiple cars, multiple vehicles. How do we address that?
Blocks of flats in particular. It's a big issue in my postbag.
I think you see a mix because it depends on the type of blocks of flats you're talking about. I live in a block of flats and we have chargers in our parking lot at the bottom of the building. That's one option. It does come with complications about who pays for it. Is it coming from the service charge or somewhere else? It also comes with complications about how do you handle billing different residents within the building. So I think that'll be one part of it. There's also issues, of course, with there could be shared car parks outside of the property. Is that public or is it private? And should chargers go there? And again, who's paying for them? There's a lot of complexity there. I think the government committed at the back end of last year to look at the right to charge, which is something that's been cited as an example from Norway. I think that's been caught up in the complexity of our housing system and leasehold, and how do you make it work from a rights and obligations perspective. So I think there's a lot of complexity there, but clearly a really important part of the picture we need to move faster on.
Am I right that in more recent developments it's a requirement of planning permission that EV charging is made available in blocks of flats? Whether that gives you a right to park, because most of our blocks of flats do not have one space, one flat. But I know that the requirement for the facility is there. It's also, I think, a requirement in new housing developments of housing estates as well.
Yes, the building regs Part S made that change a couple of years ago, and it's being reviewed at the moment.
Everything built within the last 2 years, or granted planning permission within the last 2 years?
Dependent on the type of building, but yes, generally.
Okay, yeah. But there are other challenges to charging in blocks of flats, getting access, my casework, for older blocks of flats more than 2 or 3 years old. David, do you have...
From network operators' perspective, they will provide the reinforcements or the connection points up to whatever type of connection or EV charging project is looking to connect. I am sure that there'll be cases where the networks also face some of that complexity in terms of access and arrangements on sites or where the infrastructure is rooted on shared properties, but it's not a critical path item from a network's delivery point of view more generally, and the network operators will be looking to support whatever connection request does come forward from either an individual or a landowner or a charge point installer.
Okay. Going back to cross-pavement charging then, councils have worked over the years that I'm aware of clearing streets of street furniture and obstacles just for accessibility issues. But with cross-pavement charging, how do we ensure that doesn't create new safety issues?
I think I can pick up some of the stuff around the cross-pavement channel funding, which has recently been released. I think the deadline for it was towards the end of last year. I think local authorities recognise that this is a need. They welcome the government funding. They welcome the fact that the government funding doesn't have an end date to it, so that they can really think about where this type of solution is actually best placed. One of the things that has been a challenge is the timing of that fund release in the Levi tender process, because potentially wide-scale rollout of cross-pavement charging could have an implication on viability of Levi spaces. And as Jarrod indicated, as Levi is moved out much more rapidly over the next couple of years, some of those confidence issues around availability of public charging in a location that is close to your property should start to be alleviated. The discussions that I've had with our local authorities is that they're thinking around the cross-pavement channel funding is at quite an early stage. They're potentially looking at maybe focusing attention on allowing it to be undertaken in areas where new infrastructure won't be coming forward in a reasonable time frame, but also potentially on those that may require proximity to their property from other reasons such as disability, so motability, members being prioritised for cross-charging approval. I think one of the main challenges within this is obviously the differential between the cost of private charging and the cost of public charging. So, as anything that can be done to kind of rationalise that, I think would ease the demand from the cross-pavement charging perspective, because people will feel that they're not having to pay notably more for their public charging than they are for private charging. I think one of the other things to consider is it starts to give the perception of ownership of the space on the public highway that is outside your property, which ultimately comes with longer term challenges when authorities maybe are wanting to change that streetscape for other reasons. Public highway is public highway, anyone can park and use it, but when you're when you've got a charge cable that runs across that pavement to a particular point on that street, that starts to indicate that that bit is yours.
Okay, so that covers the sort of...
So can I just say, so even, because obviously we're getting lobbied about why can't our local authority, in my case Hounslow, which has been quite progressive on rolling out EV charging for residents, but the idea of avoiding the trip hazard by having a gully to put a wire through with a robust cover, but Hounslow is pushing back because of risks and other issues. Are there potential solutions? I know Hounslow is not alone in having that concern. Are there possible solutions for gully charging, notwithstanding the very valid point you've just made about it's not a private space on the curbside?
I think those designs are coming forward. I think but each. So while there is a level of standardisation on pavement infrastructure, it's not consistent everywhere, and I think there does need to be a view taken as to the the appropriateness of that solution in any given space. Based on other users, so high school usage or high hospital usage, or what other activities are occurring within the street space that is being proposed.
I suspect it's possibly particularly an issue in London with fairly high propensity for take-up, but a large number of street terrace houses on properties with no off-street parking, and people are looking to be able to charge very near their home. But maybe that's a London issue. Okay, thank you very much. I now go on to Ollie on cost for users.
Thank you, Chair. We touched earlier about some of the issues affecting the cost of using public charging infrastructure. So what should be done to tackle the significant affordability gap between home charging and reliance on public charging? Let's take that first.
I'm happy to kick off. I think to some extent trying to get, if our goal is to get public charging to be as cheap as home charging, I think we'll struggle. There is a huge amount of investment that goes into public charging infrastructure. The hardware will cost tens of thousands of pounds, grid connections hundreds of thousands of pounds, and all the ongoing services that go with it, which are involved in operating public infrastructure, helpline, support, maintenance and so on. I don't think we're ever going to get them to parity. What we do think, though, is that the prices, and this is backed up by the stats, the prices are higher than they used to be and higher than they need to be. Whether you look at rapid and ultra-rapid or what used to be called slow and fast and now has changed names. That, for us, is caused very directly by the increase in standing charges, which we've had to pass on. And the impact for drivers I talked about earlier, I think the practical impact is that we can no longer tell every potential EV driver that they will make a saving by switching. We used to be able to say that. We've proven that we can say that in the early 2020s. The increases in these charges mean that if you rely exclusively on rapid and ultra-rapid, which admittedly will not be many people because there's lots of different options, you will pay more than petrol. And that is not where we should be. It's not where we were. And given it's got a policy cause behind it, we think there's a policy solution too. The final thing I'll say is that we know affordability and the cost of ownership is a really important way of attracting people to make this switch. Lots of people have already made the switch for net zero reasons or environmental reasons. We now need to go to the next level, which is convince people to switch because they'll feel the benefit in their pocket. EV drivers used to feel that very, very clearly, slightly less clearly now, but we think we should get back there, and that will get more people into these vehicles as well.
Any thoughts from anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just echo that around, I guess, the cost base for electricity compared to some of the domestic charges. One of the things that we've been talking about with customers is around the difference in VAT charges. Probably not best place to comment on it in terms of the structure of that, but that is something that there is a difference there, and that does end up feeding into some of the fees that customers pay.
I think one thing I'd like to raise is the risk of effectively making this too cheap, and that comes with a bit of sensitivity, recognising obviously the cost of living challenges that people are facing and others, but our evidence has shown that when we model a high EV uptake scenario within the east of England, you are seeing reductions in walking and cycling and also in rail use, not so much a shift in bus user, and I think that's partly due to the different user audiences and customer bases. But a vehicle is a vehicle. It takes up space in the road. It has an implication for and that has implications for congestion, productivity, wider health and well-being, placemaking, and road safety as well. So I think yes, there needs to be a reasonable and affordable approach to this, but you take it too far and you risk seeing knock-on implications to wider transport policy.
I think that's a very important point to make, and I think your modelling is also supported by emerging experience evidence from Norway, given their very high use of EVs that they have also seen, starting to see erosion of active travel in public transport use rates.
Okay, thank you for those responses. And now, Jacob.
Thank you. We've touched on the Levi Fund before. How effective do you think this has been in increasing charging infrastructure? Jarrod, do you want to start?
So far, because of where we are in the process, not particularly effective. We're in the early stages of contracts being awarded and signed now. I think at my last check there was 7 had been awarded, of many more than that. The fund was announced several years ago now, and it's been tough going to get it out of the door, quite frankly, and I think everybody's as frustrated as each other on the speed of that. Some of that has been sort of typical issues with getting government funding out. It's obviously a complex area where we're working with local authorities and combined authorities across England, and certainly my members have been waiting very readily to put this infrastructure in the ground for quite some time now, so somewhat impatient to do that. I think we will start to see this year, interested in Esme's view on this, I think we will start to see that money now paying dividends in the form of lots and lots of charging infrastructure being deployed across England, which would be really exciting. So all the frustration will be eventually made worth it. I think this year, as I said earlier, it's going to be worth about 100,000 charge points, so more than we already have in the ground today. And I think ordinary drivers will see that and feel that, and hopefully it encourages them to make the switch as well.
Just to come in on that, I think local authorities have obviously needed to build up their capacity and capability in this space in order to be able to then start to appoint and move forward. The Capacity and Capability Fund from government has been very helpful, but obviously there is an upskilling that is required in that, as well as relationship building and being able to get everybody moving in the right direction at the right time. There's been challenges with overall procurement processes, so changes in guidance around using the Oxford Dynamic Purchasing Framework has slowed down what people, the route that people thought they could use, and they've now had to go to individual tenders rather than using frameworks. And those that went early, I think, benefited from a quieter market, but found finalising contracts slower because there was a lot of toing and froing between the supplier and the authority on the clarification questions around risk management and what happens of non-delivery, etc. Those that went later found that suppliers were then struggling to respond to tenders because they were being quite stretched with the number that were going out at one point in time, but have been able to move through those latter stages of that contracting process faster because some of those fundamental issues had been resolved through other tender processes. So I think authorities have also welcomed the change to funding allocations with that Levi funding, with that funding coming up front, with unlike the AUX funding, which had 75% up front and 25% on completion and a hard deadline on that. The Levi funding allows them to plan their strategy well, go through their procurement and design their procurement processes in a way that best suits their authority. So I'm aware that certainly a couple of our authorities have split up their tenders for slightly different infrastructure to be able to deal with the different streetscape environments and locations that they're handling. Others are focusing on sheer numbers. Others are, while some others are looking at different routes for deployment. So I think we will start to see that coming forward quite quickly. I'm aware that certainly in the East, 3 of our core authorities have got their procurement agreed now and are moving to appointment, have appointed or are moving to appointment. So the on-street environment will be changing quite quickly through that process.
And have you had helpful guidance and support through that procurement process?
Yeah, the feedback that we've had from our authorities is that they've really welcomed the support that DFT, OZEV and Energy Saving Trust particularly have provided them. They've also welcomed the availability of data through things like the ZapMap, open source data, and also the data and insight that some of the subnational transport bodies had done in advance of this to enable them to be able to assess their needs, things like grid capacity, informing things like grid capacity, propensity for change, and some of those areas where it might be more challenging to deploy, have all allowed authorities to get to a good, strong place relatively quickly, at least to be able to then get as Jarrod said, the right charger in the right location, and hopefully be able to make that back end of that process as smooth as possible for the charge point operators once they start getting on the ground.
And the rapid charging fund has been removed. What impact has that had, if any? Does anybody want to speak to that, Wes?
I don't think it will have a huge impact. I think partly because of the way that the cost base has changed, going back to it again, where actually, someone put to me the other day, there's no point me being given grant funding to buy a supercar if I can't fill it with petrol. It's the same, as an analogy, it's the same point. It's not necessarily that there's the funding, they need the funding for that initial build out, it's actually just operating the sites and putting together an investment case in those businesses is just, because of the cost of electricity in a way that's apportioned, that's just gone down.
David, did you?
I can't comment from the kind of installers and the market's perspective on impacts of the business case, but from a network operator's perspective, we're aware that it hasn't been progressed, and we've had regular engagement with the DfT around that, and where still networks need to play a part in those types of projects going forward. But beyond that, can't really comment from a network operator's perspective.
So one of the overall criticisms of government grant schemes is obviously they can take a long time, as you said, Jarrod, to get in place and lack that long-term certainty. Is that the case that you've seen with the Levi funding, and if so, what has been the impact of that? Do you want to just pick up?
Yeah, so I think Levi's a little bit different in that it was a fairly large amount of funding that we knew would come at some point, so we didn't have the sort of cliff edge effect or wondering where it would be quite so much as we have with others. I think where this does play out as an issue is on in the parts of the sector where long-term certainty is really, really important, and we don't tend to see that. For example, when you look at freight and trucks and vans, which I think we might cover in more detail, those decisions about electrification of those vehicles, of putting charging in at your depot, take place over a much longer period than the months that we sometimes get to look at a scheme and work out how long it will last. I do recognise the reasons why some of this funding can't be extended out, both from a fiscal perspective and the way that the process works with Treasury, but clearly increases in grants or introduction of grants halfway through a financial year and it's gone at the end of the year is not conducive to making long-term strategic decisions about your fleet. So that there is an issue there, I think.
Anybody else?
I would just reinforce that point from a network operator perspective. Anything that provides more certainty and long-term clarity on what infrastructure requirements customers have benefits networks and their ability to kind of have visibility and plan later investments and reinforcement to that timeline.
Yeah, and just if you're going to put grant funding in place, making sure that's aligned with changes that DESNES and Ofgem are doing on the electricity side, so that's conducive to actually supporting the industry as a whole. Super important.
Okay, thank you. And I need to apologise for the noise outside earlier. An important message being made that getting fit through dance is a good thing, but I'm not sure that may or may not have involved Angela Rippon and Mr. Speaker dancing together. But the point is we've got some serious work going on here, and I will see what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Okay, can we now move back to the serious business in hand? The charging infrastructure for logistics, which was touched on earlier, but Elsie, you've got some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. So the success of our national logistics sector as a sort of backbone of our national economy and really important to my local economy actually as well, is sort of dependent on the sector keeping pace with change. What would you say are the main differences in the challenges for expanding charging infrastructure for vans and goods vehicles compared to personal cars? I know that some of you touched on this earlier, but Mr. Birch, can we start with you on that one?
Sure, I'd point to two things. One is space. Clearly larger vehicles need more space to charge, and sometimes car charging bays are not big enough for vans. That's something we're aware of. And clearly not often the right size for a HGV. So there's an issue of space and making sure there's enough space to charge safely. Some of the answer to that will be charging at depots, particularly for trucks, but also for some vans. For some vans, the answer will also be charging overnight and making sure that you start your day with a full battery. But clearly the infrastructure also, the on-the-go infrastructure also needs to serve them. So there's an issue with space. The other one, which has been a theme throughout, is the cost of the power. If you're putting charging in at a depot, you'll be taking a very large connection, you'll be using a lot of electricity, and you'll be paying very, very significant standing charges. In our discussions with fleets and logistics sector, they cite that as a really important blocker as part of the total cost of ownership consideration, which is even more important to them than to ordinary people. We hear that those costs mean that they look at the cost of switching their fleets over to an electric fleet, and sometimes it's too high for them to justify. So space and power.
That's helpful. Mr. Scott, I don't know if you've got comments on this one.
No, I echo all of those, to be honest. I think, when you think about some of these businesses, they're having to almost put together investment cases internally in terms of putting money into changing the way those fleets are set up. From the discussions that we've had in terms of the cost parity between switching from electricity to diesel and the total cost of ownership of that, you're almost on parity. There used to be a significant advantage to turning electric. I think in the next few years that will probably go the other way, which is not a positive thing for the decarbonisation of this sector and actually the electrification moving forward. Actually just total cost of power is only going up over the next 4 to 5 years for the transport sector. So that's a real key for them.
And from a combined authority perspective, do you have any comments on this?
I think in general, the ports and the logistics sector is quite fragmented and operates on quite tight cost margins in general. So you are beginning to see obviously some of the bigger operators moving in this direction. We're seeing that ports and free ports are taking a lead in this space. So Port of Tilbury, with the support of Thames Freeport, has just launched 16 HGV chargers in their area. Port of Felixstowe, Maritime Transport at Port of Felixstowe already has HGV chargers in situ. Obviously that's one end of that network, and ensuring that they have the resilience through the strategic road network with work through national highways, and also at the depot and at the end of that process, I think is really important. I am aware that National Highways is doing work in this area to start mapping where those that demand may be best served, and GridServe and others in the E-corridor work are looking at this space as well. So again, I think it's an area that will start to move forward more rapidly, but the point around that's got to align the energy demand grid connections, the driver time travel, and where they should be taking rest points, resilience across the network in terms of uncertainty of journey times, and also that these this infrastructure, where it's not coming in on existing locations such as larger service stations, is going to have to go through local authority planning consent. These are the types of things that communities struggle with often in terms of look, design, vehicle movement, and operating hours. So there can be a bit of a challenge in securing that agreement through the consent process as well. So I think all of these things need to be looked at in quite a systemic way in order to identify the right locations, get the buy-in from local authorities, and be able to deliver that infrastructure on the ground.
And I know, my colleague wants to comment on this just quickly. I just wondered from sort of a safety or accessibility perspective, some of those things that you were touching on earlier, Dr. Bulawa. I just wondered if you had any comments on this as well.
Just on particularly for motorway service areas and maybe some other commercial premises where the leases are not long enough to invest, is that a challenge that you're picking up?
Absolutely. Some of the depots where they're leasing those depots and having to work with a landlord and almost sell it to the landlord to then electrify that site, despite them having maybe a shorter lease period. Yes, definitely a challenge. Again, we go back to the investment case of that, where actually if there is one, that whole conversation becomes a bit easier, I think.
Alex, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. So that was a bit of a discussion about the main challenges or the main differences in the challenges between charging for cars versus HGVs. Could you now touch upon HGVs versus coaches for me, please? Who wants to start? Wesley, you're looking keen on that one.
To be honest, they're very similar models. What you tend to see is almost base-to-base models, and I think the planning and construction of those sites tends to be, for businesses, a little bit easier to plan. I think HGVs are probably a fair bit further behind in the infrastructure build-out compared to some of the coaches and buses, and I think where you've got logistics businesses where they can plan routes around the country, for them that's a lot simpler than HGVs that might have to change route each day. And I think getting them access to better public charge points, and some of these HGVs are massive, so making sure the infrastructure can fit them in as well as private cars is going to be super important.
I take slight issue on that in the sense that I think buses obviously do have fixed routes. Coaches tend to do various different journeys. So, because I think there is a difference between bus infrastructure and coach infrastructure. Anyway, anyone else?
I'll just come in, and it's just a few reflections from the network's perspective, both for EHGVs and logistic vehicles, and some of those larger power consuming transport contexts. First, the main point network operators would emphasize on this is the importance of those customers who are going through those discussions internally in business case considerations to engage with their network operators early, as shaping that kind of the request, understanding the customer needs, and planning collectively the time for both the charging infrastructure and all the business changes that go with that, along with the network works. Doing that collectively can give a very different outcome, whether if there isn't collaboration. Just to bring that to life a bit, there's a hypothetical scenario where a customer has gone through months and years of planning this transition for their business, maybe even preparing sites with the installations of charge points, and then coming to the network operator and requesting megawatts of capacity, and then that timeline is at the end of the process. If they engage the networks early on that process, they can collaboratively develop ramped connections or phased increases in capacity for the customers. Generally speaking, even for these larger projects, if the engagement happens early, the network infrastructure can develop in line with the rest of the project that this business is going through. So that early collaboration is really important. And one of the things that network operators have done working with ChargeUK and many other stakeholders was to prepare a transport connections guidance tool, which all the networks contributed to, and provides guidance on when to engage, what are the things that drive the availability of the network infrastructure, what data helps inform what solutions are available to them. So that's live on the website and has lots of use and positive feedback from stakeholders. It really does, again, emphasize that importance of early collaboration for these types of bigger decarbonisation fleets, for example.
And does government need to have a policy specifically for the coach industry, in terms of perhaps suggesting what kind of vehicles they might be having, or trying to work out where some of these, high-powered charging at service stations for their 50-odd passengers should be?
I don't know enough about the area to comment in detail. I think on buses, they've put money into the bus sector through a grant, I think it's called Zebra, which is from...
They have, which coaches are excluded from.
Which coaches are included. Well, that might be why it's not crossed my desk before. And obviously there's an open consultation on the regulatory framework for trucks. I don't know whether coaches is potentially slipping through the cracks of those two things, but I'd be happy to look into it and write to the committee with more.
Okay, thank you. Ollie, did you want to come in on this?
Oh, I'm all right, Chair.
It's covered. Okay, thank you very much. Right, now we move on to another issue. Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. We've heard that there's an increasing cable theft and vandalism occurring across the country. What impact does this have on the charging network, especially given that there's obviously a growing number of vehicles reliant on it? Mr. Birch, do you want to start off?
Yeah, this is a real and growing problem. I think, unfortunately, we don't have fantastic data on the size of the problem, but certainly hundreds of incidents of cable theft since 2022. And what we're talking about here is someone coming along and literally chopping the cable off for the materials that are within the cable. That is likely an underestimate. I suspect that based on the data we've got, I think the data we have is from FOIs of different police forces, so we've not got full coverage, but we think it's a real and growing problem. It causes us an immense amount of frustration and cost because we have to replace the cable. It can cost tens of thousands of pounds to fix a site once the cables are gone. Which is money we clearly rather spend on new infrastructure. It also obviously causes frustration for drivers because they arrive and sometimes find a charger with a cable that's missing, which is really upsetting. In terms of what we've done, we've been trying to look and share practice across the sector on what the technologies are to push back on this. So CCTV is now much more common at charging sites than it used to be, which I think is beneficial for various reasons. We talked about safety earlier. You also see alarms which trigger when someone tries to tamper with the cable, which doesn't necessarily stop them from tampering with the first one, but certainly stops them from tampering with the others. And over the last year or two, we've started to see cable sheaths, which essentially make it difficult to chop through the cable. And those do seem to be successful to some extent. I think the challenge we have is what to do about it. Clearly, cutting off a cable of this type is already a crime. We have had some good engagement from local forces, but of course we then need to see coordination between them because this is a national problem. We've also had engagement with national groups that look at infrastructure crime, and it does seem that this is part of a wider pattern. I don't know whether it happens on the electricity networks. I suspect it does, of people attacking this sort of national infrastructure and for their own personal gain. So I think it's too complicated to have an easy answer, but certainly it's something we'd love to see resolved because it's costing us money and it's costing drivers the experience they want.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Boyer, I didn't know if you had any comments on this actually.
I recognise that some of the impacts that were spoken about there. On the electricity network infrastructure side of things, we do monitor it closely. It's not something we've seen a particular uptake in the way that's been described there, but we do continue to monitor it. Network assets, electricity network assets are less public facing and they're more heavily kept so and protected, not least of all for key safety reasons. So, but it is something we continue to monitor.
And yeah, Ms. Yuill, I just wondered if this is something that you've seen sort of in your local area and what you think some of the sort of solutions might be when it comes to increasing some of the protections for this type of infrastructure.
It's not something that we've had fed back to us specifically, but I will go and check with our authorities whether it's an increasing problem for them.
Okay, and yeah, just to see if anybody else has got a view about how we increase protections really. Mr. Scott, no? Any more comments? Okay.
Well, it puts me on the record in case any would-be thefts are watching. These cables are not worth that much. It's really not worth the risk. They're really not worth as much as people think they are.
Okay.
Thank you. Ollie, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think you've alluded to it. I worked in railways before I came here, and cable theft for signalling cables on the railways can be a big problem. It does tend to be quite cyclical with the price of copper and other assets. So it was just a thought: is how much are you being able to learn from sectors that have been dealing with this historically? Is there more of a role for the police or government, insurers, whoever, to try and spread some of that best practice and learning so you're not having to start from scratch?
Yes, and that's the progress I think we've made over the last couple of years. So we're now in contact with the National Infrastructure Crime Reduction Partnership, who I understand work with the railways. They do have some lessons for us from those sectors. I don't think it has paid dividends yet in terms of a significant reduction. I do think one thing we should learn as a collective from railways or from the electricity networks is data and coordination across the authorities. I'm not sure to what extent that will resolve the problem, but it does seem from the outside looking in as a policing expertise person that it's a bit like playing whack-a-mole. You go to one local police force and tell them it's a problem, and they haven't heard of it because the one next door didn't tell them. I think there might be something there, but I don't know how well it got resolved at the railways on the railway side.
I mean, just very briefly on that, there was a similar thing of different network rail routes would get really good at it, but others would then be playing catch up when it started happening with them. And it's all the things you alluded to are the right kind of things. It's all about that balance between hardening the asset, target hardening to use this silly jargon, with patrolling, good surveillance, and then some of the things you said about alarms. So I think you've got the right kind of thoughts, but I just think it's always helpful in life is where there's experience and insight from others. It's always good if we're not starting from the beginning because it just wastes time. But you're on with that. So.
Okay, I've got a wind-up question, and I've also got a question myself and colleagues. We have a bit of time. If anyone has other questions, they may want to that occur to them. My question is public parking, but not on the public highway. And we know that supermarkets and other private sector providers are often quite good at providing publicly accessible charging points on their land. But are there other landowners where there could be better take-up? And I think of rail and station parking at rail stations. Are they sufficiently engaged? And is there an opportunity, particularly as we move it to GBR? Or are there other examples of where opportunities for whatever structural reason are not being sufficiently taken up for publicly accessible charging? And Esme, just council car parks.
So council car parks are very much the thinking within the Levi funding, and the identification of those is within that mapping. The other area that they're working quite closely with on from a rural perspective is parish councils, community centres, in those sorts of spaces, and also kind of the idea of the pub is the hub for more rural spaces, although that is that does very much depend on the landlords and the owners of that type of asset. I think, that's certainly something that's within the mix for those more rural spaces.
And is local government actively supported in looking for those partnerships? I mean, it takes time and officer time to build up those relationships and so on.
Those are easily done within their existing network. So, parish councils, etc., district councils, absolutely no problem. I think those that are slightly more complex, it does very much depend on the infrastructure that currently exists within an authority and the proximity of relationships between different parts of the authority and the wider business community. So I think particularly as the Levi Fund starts to roll out, some of this will become easier and faster, and those that are interested and are eligible will start to come forward more rapidly. I'm not aware that there is any so the new fund that was announced last week, I think also looks at small businesses, which would also be helpful, but I think how much they can become fully public chargers is obviously a risk for that particular local business.
Yes, Alex.
Is there also obviously an opportunity as well as a risk? I remember at Labour Party conference, Ruth, you might have been to it too, there was a campaign of tourist attractions that were installing EV points. Bon Voy Charge, I think it was. Yes, it was a good name. And they were very much selling it as something that would not only help the customer who was going there, but also might be a revenue stream for the tourist attraction. So are there, we've mainly been highlighting some of the challenges of putting in the infrastructure, but are there also revenue opportunities for businesses deciding to go down that path?
Yes, and you'll see a few different models. You could have anything from the chargement operator sort of renting the land and taking care of everything and sharing some of the revenue, all the way up to the destination itself, purchasing the charger, and perhaps working with someone to provide them the software to manage it and change the prices and tariffs, and indeed that can be a revenue stream. I suppose one risk is that if the energy costs have gone up, as we've been talking about, then we've lost a little bit of the incentive for doing so. But indeed, that campaign was fantastic for raising awareness, which I think is as much of a problem as anything else.
Just on that, seasonality is a real challenge in an area like the East, which has high domestic tourism, and that implication of demand for very short periods of time, particularly even days, depending on if it's an event, is something that is quite hard for authorities to work through. In our Rural Connections report a couple of years ago, it got challenges around rural grid connectivity, even at a relatively low level for consistent charging, did come up as being a challenge in terms of cost for small businesses, campsites and others who would like to be able to offer this, to be able to do so. We're also undertaking a bit of work with our visitor economy currently, and I will make sure that this is one of the questions that gets asked in that space, to be able to flush out some more understanding around the challenges for the visitor economy.
Okay, thank you. We've only touched on a couple of, I think only once, on how on what happens in other jurisdictions, other countries. We've raised quite a lot of challenges today. Price, not spots, and grid connectivity in particular. Are there examples from other equivalent economies that have got it right that the UK could learn from and perhaps implement? I mean, I think it's Jarrod. You've worked in the EU on this, so maybe you're the person I should be asking.
Yeah. So I was letting others go first because I will bore you to sleep over the next 30 seconds. The major thing that we see that happens in European Union in particular that we don't have here is the renewable transport fuels obligation. This is essentially a renewable credit scheme that you, if you supply renewable energy up to a cap, you get a credit and you can sell that credit to people that are also having to comply with the scheme. In the European Union, as of last May, every single member state has to include electric vehicle charging in that scheme, which allows charge point operators to generate those credits and sell those credits to other people, other organisations having to comply. What that does is make a massive difference from a viability perspective, because the credits, depending on where you are in Europe, are worth anywhere between 2.5 to 8.5 pence per kilowatt hour. You can, as a charge point operator, invest that back in your pricing, pass it directly on or pass some of it on. But it also helps to justify investments in sites that might be right on the borderline of being viable. That is enough to make a big difference to tip it over the edge. So what we hear from our members that are operating in Europe is they sort of jealously look at their counterparts in the Netherlands or Germany who have these credit schemes and say, if I had that, I would be able to invest so much more in the infrastructure. And as I say, that is now in place across the European Union, right on our doorstep, and is putting them at something of a competitive advantage to us, at least on that front.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, and my final question to all of you, and I'll start with Esme. What's the most important thing that the government should do within the charging network to help ease the EV transition?
I think the one thing that's come out in the conversations with the local authorities most recently is around the shift to that permitting system under the Planning and Infrastructure Act. There does seem to be uncertainty in that space around local authorities' approach to that. So, increased support, guidance, or detail on how best to set up new permitting schemes would probably start to accelerate the delivery on network quite quickly.
Helpful, thank you. Wesley?
Well, electricity pricing, which I've already talked about at length, but I think an important point to make is around the BIC scheme, which is coming in from next year, the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme. That's a scheme that's is designed to basically give discounts to industries on their environmental levies they're paying as part of their bills. They'll be worth about 6.5 pence on a bill. It's quite a lot. At the moment, when Ofgem and DESNZ are designing that, transport is not part of that, charging networks are not part of that, logistics fleets are not part of that. The idea is that it's meant to be covering 7,000 businesses or around that number around the country. I think getting transport heavy businesses into that is going to be hugely important.
Helpful, thank you. Nicole.
From my point of view, I think we need to move a bit more towards standardization, towards more formality in the market, because it's typical for an emerging market that there is a lot of informality, but I think the next step would be to go towards more standards, towards more guidance, and also towards more representation, to include...
But more guidance or more almost regulations, more specific?
More specific.
More specific.
And I understand that this is always a tricky balance to kind of achieve, but I think it would be helpful. The same goes for the representation. I think we have a lot of infrastructure. There's going to be more infrastructure, but we need to show people that the infrastructure is there. We need a signature. We need to make them prominent, because that goes into that whole legitimization of the market.
Thank you.
If I can be cheeky, I have two, both that we've spoken about already. First is the reforms around planning and way leaves and consents to enable networks to deliver both the infrastructure generally, but also the specific connections works for EV charge points. And the second is really continued support in making sure the next price control processes and outcomes are reflective of the need for networks to bring in and allow them to bring in that additional investment in expanded infrastructure that will directly underpin the EV charge point transition.
Thank you.
I'll also take two, if I may, Chair. One is something I've not mentioned so far, which is the ZEV mandate. Retain the ZEV mandate. It's what drives us to invest. It's what's got us to this point. Moving on it now will not be helpful. The other is to address energy costs, as Wes helpfully set out in advance.
Okay. Thank you to all of our witnesses. That brings this session to a close. And I'd like to thank you all for your evidence. Please do write in if you feel there's anything you'd like to cover in more detail that we've not been able to cover this morning. And we look forward to resuming our oral evidence on this inquiry in a few weeks' time. That concludes today's meeting. Order.